Hello and good evening. I'm Karen Taylor. I'm Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and we're delighted that you could be here this evening. I just want to say a few things before introducing our speaker. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. The Landmark Lectures are additionally supported by Bauer and Dean Publishers. I also wanted to thank New York Landmarks Conservancy for their support in promoting tonight's event, and to remind you that after the lecture there'll be a short wine and cheese reception that we hope you will stay for. For those of you who might be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was a non-profitable organization that was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen and artisans of New York City at that time. Today, this 229-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of New York City. It does this in various ways through its educational, philanthropic, and cultural programs. This includes its tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, which of course you're in now, and its nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of course of which tonight is part of. During the Landmark Lecture Series, 4 New York architects were chosen to highlight iconic buildings and landmarks of social, historical, and cultural significance, with the series created by Lisa Easton, a partner at Easton Architects. This is our final Landmark Lecture this season. Our final speaker for the series, the Landmark Series, is Cleary Larkin, an associate at Beyer Blinder Belle. And tonight, as you know, Cleary will discuss her work on the restoration of the Beacon Theatre, a New York City interior landmark that was reopened in 2009. Miss Larkin joined BBB in 2007 upon completion of her graduate degree in historic preservation at Columbia University. As an integral member of BBB's historic preservation team, she has worked on other notable historic and landmark projects that include the Empire State Building, the Morgan Library and Museum, Grand Central Terminal, and Brooklyn Navy Yard. Prior to moving to New York, Ms. Larkin worked for an architectural and planning firm in Virginia. Her expertise also includes research and writing for Historic Structures Report, National Register nominations, and the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit applications. I'm so pleased to introduce to you Cleary Larkin.
Thank you, Karen, and the entire team here for having me. Thank you all for coming. Before I get started, I'm going to take a little poll. Who has seen a show at the Beacon? Oh, that's a good number. Who has seen a show at the Beacon pre-2007? It's a good number, too. Who's seen a show after 2009? Okay, not so many of you. Get out and see a show there. It's a great space. I think you'll be really surprised by what you see there if you had been pre-restoration. So for those of you that have not been, the Beacon Theatre is located on the Upper West Side at Broadway and West 74th Street. It was constructed between 1927 and 1929 as the Roxy Midway, a deluxe movie palace, and designed by Chicago architect Walter Allschlager and interior designers Rapp and Rambush Studios. The theater and adjacent 21st-story Beacon Hotel are listed on the National Register, and the theater itself is a New York City landmark. In 2007, Beyer Blinder Belle was hired by Madison Square Garden, the operator and lessee of the Beacon, to upgrade the interior of the theater for its continuing use as a concert venue. Early meetings with MSG contain the phrases rockhouse and let's maintain that gritty feeling. This was, after all, the premier rock venue where the Allman Brothers staged their annual 2-week run of performances. However, what we actually ended up creating, a close to complete interior restoration, went above and beyond the initial scope and budget of the project, thanks to the historic research and testing done by the design team and the decision by the client to go the extra mile and recreate this spectacular space. Tonight I'll discuss the restoration project. I'll also talk about the movie theater as an architectural typology that grew from a neighborhood storefront venue to the magnificent movie palace of the 1920s. In the United States, the first movie theaters began around 1905 with the Nickelodeon. Architecturally, these were often converted storefront theaters located in urban commercial districts and along the densely populated streets of working class and immigrant neighborhoods. When you think of the flickering black and white silent film accompanied by a tinkling piano, you are likely thinking of what was shown in the Nickelodeon. In the history of movies, Nickelodeons are considered important for 3 things: providing motion pictures with the first exhibition venue of their own, establishing a stable pattern for the distribution and exhibition of movies, and shaping and building an audience on which the motion picture studios were to depend for 4 decades. Nickelodeons were competition for vaudeville, a popular form of live entertainment originating in New York City in 1881. However, by the early 1910s, silent celluloid photoplays often supplemented live vaudeville acts. This combination of live performance, music, and film marks the shift to the popularity of the growing movie industry. Architecturally, we start to see some of the better-known elements of movie theaters evolving from vaudeville. Whether a building was a storefront conversion or a purpose-built building for theater use, we see that the architecture of the theater was pure economic strategy, attracting moviegoers through broad marquees, decorative box offices with bronze and marble cladding, and often extravagant exteriors and entries. Outdoor electrical signage was actually pioneered on early Nickelodeons. The early movie palaces were purpose-built to showcase silent motion pictures. Known also as combination houses, they had both a full complement of stage equipment and screens and projectors. Film technology at the time was so poor that movies were often accompanied by organs and orchestras. A typical showing might consist of a newsreel and a half-hour comedy, with an overture of orchestra music and a dimming of house lights at the start of the feature. Many movie palaces contained an orchestra pit and an organ pit, and often an extravagant organ that could make sound effects like train whistles or cuckoo clocks. Architects of this new building type were faced with complex needs almost unrivaled in their day, as the theaters required a vast collection of rooms under one roof and were often situated on irregular plots of land. The lobbies of movie palaces had to be spacious and spectacular to keep the patron's mind off the fact that he is waiting, according to interior designers Rapp and Rapp. Inside the auditorium, plush seating was wrapped in mohair or velvet, with concealed lighting in the end standards to help moviegoers navigate stairs. Theater lighting was subdued for viewing the films, but also had the capability of producing spectacular colored light shows. Movie palaces allowed patrons a refuge from the everyday, an entry to foreign worlds surrounded by magnificent environments, statuary, and murals with explosions of lights, special effects, and music. Architectural styles ran the gamut, from gilded Baroque, Rococo, and Art Deco to the exotic, the Moorish, and all combinations of above. Interior designer George Rapp described movie palaces as shrines to democracy, an architecture of fantasy that provided all the trappings of wealth, but accessible to all, a mass appeal never found at the opera. The first movie palace in New York City was the Strand Theatre, opened in 1914 at Broadway and 47th Street. It seated 3,000 people and had a second-floor balcony, an architectural innovation at the time. It had a 2-story lobby rotunda for socializing before the show and at intermission. At a cost of $1 million, it was the most lavish movie theater of its time. Most early movie theaters were owned and operated by local impresarios, independent of the movie studios. The owners of the Strand Theatre hired Samuel Roxy Rothafel as manager. During his career, Rothafel was not only a theater manager, but also a stage producer, radio broadcaster, musical arranger, and international celebrity. He helped engineer the integration of film music and live performance in silent film exhibition. He wrote the scores to early films and helped movies and moviegoing become the dominant form of mass entertainment between the world wars. Rothafel's time at the Strand was early in his career, but he soon became the most acclaimed showman on the East Coast, managing such well-known theaters as the Regent, the Capitol, and the Rialto. But all of these theaters were only a dress rehearsal for his greatest invention. In 1925, Rothafel was hired by financier Herbert Lubin to develop a movie theater and hotel from the ground up on 50th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues near the Broadway Theater District. Planned to be the world's largest movie palace, Rothafel's Roxy Theatre opened March 11th, 1927, at a cost of nearly $12 million. This 5,920-seat auditorium boasted a 110-piece orchestra, a 100-person chorale group, a 22-foot-long electric switchboard to operate 25,000 house lights, a lighting plant that apparently could power a city of 250,000, a broadcast room, a radio station, a musical library containing 10,000 musical numbers and 50,000 orchestrations. The Roxy even had its own hospital for employees or patrons who were under the weather. The orchestra pit held 3 immense organ consoles, including a custom-designed Kimball described as capable of a range for musical production perhaps never before attempted on any organ. In addition to the organ were the Deegan Tower chimes, 21 bells originally intended for a belfry, but located high up in the proscenium, and a fanfare chamber equivalent to 24 trumpets and 16 trombones. All of these musical instruments were played from the organ consoles at the stage level. The seats were red, the walls were buff with golden tones, the light fixtures and chandeliers made of decorative wrought iron. The great bronze rotunda contained 12 marble columns rising 5 stories over a 2-ton oval rug, which at 58 feet wide and a cost of $15,000 was also the largest of its kind at the time. Rothafel called the architectural scheme Roman with a quick journey into Africa, or Spanish Renaissance with a touch of the Oriental. It's easy to see why architectural critics at the time held theater designers in such low esteem. Technologically, the theater was the most advanced of its time. The stage was set low so that no matter where you were seated, you didn't have to strain your neck looking up at the stage. The stage had 2 hydraulic lifts for creating multiple level changes. A gigantic cyclorama made of plaster and steel and weighing 10 tons was located at the rear of the stage for diffusing sound and providing animated rear-projected backdrops. A complex system of traps handled scenery and magic draperies, which absorbed and diffused colored lighting for special effects. The Roxy also had its projection booth placed in the front of the balcony, a departure from normal movie theaters where the typical projection throw of the film was so lengthy that the figures on the screen were often distorted. Instead of the usual 200-foot throw, the placement of the projectors in the balcony reduced the throw to exactly 100 feet. So I'm going to pause here and walk you through this section. Not sure how readable that is. So when you entered here at this entrance hall, the thing to think about these theaters is that it's really a procession. So you're coming from the blah outside world, life is mundane, and you're coming to the theater to escape. So you come into this small-scale entry hall, maybe a little dark, pretty small space, and then you enter into this grand foyer where all of a sudden the space opens up before you and you're kind of taken away to this new elaborate world. What's interesting about this building section is that you can actually see the height of this foyer is practically 4 to 5 stories tall. So let's imagine 60 feet or so. Below this space were all of the mechanical equipment. You can see a refrigerating machine room, a humidifier room, and an air duct that went underneath the orchestra level. So these theaters had early versions of air conditioning, which is really why we all still escape to the theater in the heat of summer. From the grand foyer, you could take the stairs up to the upper levels, or you could walk immediately into the orchestra level. Now, in theater design, this is the orchestra level. The second is called the mezzanine, or the loge, L-O-G-E. And then this is the balcony area, usually divided into 2, a lower balcony, which you can see a foyer here, and an upper balcony, and its foyer was up here. And so here's the projection room at the front of the lower balcony. And you can see it's pretty close to the area where the screen would have been. This big arch over the stage was likely made of decorative and structural plaster. This is called the Proscenium. It's the decorative arch or surround that you see on a stage. This is the cyclorama. This is that plaster backdrop, and it was usually a large curved backdrop that might have had light effects. And this one was really special because it was kind of this precursor for lifting the cyclorama up into the fly space, similar one at the Beacon. So this is the fly space up here. And then above the grand ceiling at the Roxy would have been all sorts of catwalks for lighting and sound technicians. On the Roxy Theatre's opening night, the auditorium went dark, and a man in a monk's robe, illuminated by a heavenly spotlight, proclaimed, "Ye portals, bright, high, and majestic, open to our gaze the path to Wonderland. Let every day's toil be forgotten under the sheltering roof. O glorious mighty hall, thy magic and thy charm unite us all to worship at beauty's throne." Samuel Rothafel was proud to be an independent owner of the movie theater chain that he called the Roxy Circuit. With his investors, who were also independent from the movie studios, he planned 6 other theater locations in New York City, including the Roxy Mansion at 58th and Lexington and the Roxy Midway. However, 2 weeks after the Roxy Theatre opened, Herbert Lubin sold the Roxy Circuit to Fox Theatres Corporation. Plans for the Roxy Mansion were scrapped, but Fox moved forward with Rothafel, the architect Walter Allschlager, and Rambush Studios to start construction of the Roxy Midway Hotel and Theater. The construction was noted in the Department of Buildings plans as a motion picture and vaudeville house, with a construction cost of $1.75 million. Work commenced in July of 1927 and was completed in October of 1928. However, disagreements between Fox and the construction company, compounded with the possible financial difficulties of Fox Studios, led to Fox's abandonment of the project before the theater ever opened. The theater stood empty for a year, and in November of 1929, Warner Brothers took over the lease and hired Rap and Rap and Rambush Studios to undertake a $2 million renovation before opening the newly named Beacon Theatre 1 month later in December of 1929. The opening night performance consisted of speeches and grand music played on the Wurlitzer organ. The movie Tiger Rose and 4 talking shorts were shown. The theater had a magnascopic screen and a 40-foot fireproof projection booth. The organ was piped through the proscenium arch, and the upper part of the theater had a smoking room balcony with special ventilating ducts in the ceiling. The interior was described by the Moving Picture Review and Theater Management magazine as warmly magnificent, reminiscent of Byzantine and Moorish type of architecture, with a crimson and gold dome. Materials included precious metals, gold, silver, iron, steel, bronze, granite, metal, and marble. The New York Times noted the decorations to be of various styles of architecture, with Doric columns, Baroque scrollwork, murals showing Oriental caravans, and heroic Greek statues guarding the stage. The program described the decorative elements as representative of New York, which has drawn to itself all that is most gorgeous from the 4 corners of the earth. The exhibitor's Harold World hailed the Beacon as a true bit of Baghdad on Upper Broadway. You have the feeling of being in the impossibly vast tent of some fabulous Oriental ruler. So at this point, I'm going to back up and talk about those 2 years of construction at the Beacon. So Fox Pictures started the construction in July of 1927, and let's keep in mind that they filed it as a motion picture and vaudeville house. 3 months after they filed this, in October of 1927, Warner Brothers released the first talkie, The Jazz Singer. So although it only contained a few words of dialogue and 3 songs, it revolutionized the possibilities of the movie world. However, right after its release, the technology was slow to catch on. Those in the movie world were skeptical, and old-fashioned movie theaters continued to be constructed. These were a hybrid of vaudeville theaters, showing silent movies with live entertainment equipment, those combination houses that I was talking about earlier. The cost of reconstructing an auditorium to accommodate sounds was very expensive. An average tab of $30,000 was pretty steep for a struggling movie palace owner. Not to mention the transition required by actors and sound technicians, as anybody who has ever seen the movie Singing in the Rain might recall. The talkie sparked a momentary resurgence for movie palaces. By the end of 1929, Hollywood was almost all talkie, and some historians credit sound with saving the Hollywood studio system in the face of the Great Depression. Thus began what is now often called the Golden Age of Hollywood, which refers roughly to the period beginning with the introduction of sound until the late 1940s. So 3 months after they started constructing this combination house, we have the first talkie. They keep going with their construction. It wraps up in a year. Fox drops out of the lease, and the movie theater sits empty for a year. So November of 1929, by this point, remember, almost all of Hollywood is going talkie. And Warner Brothers, the inventor of the talkie movie, notices that there's this theater on the Upper West Side, the Little Roxy, of all things, that's just sitting there vacant. And what better place to snatch up and use as a talking movie palace. So a 1-month renovation for $2 million, which is more than what the building originally cost to construct 2 years earlier. I have some theories about what was original and what may be new, but none of this is definitive. Because the Roxy Midway never opened, there's no primary source evidence for what the original interiors looked like. However, comparisons between historic photos and plans reveal such striking similarities that the Beacon can be understood as a baby Roxy, a smaller, more delicate, and simplified version of the Allschlager plan for the original Roxy Theatre. Okay, so we're going to do a plan comparison. What you see on the upper left are the plans for the Roxy Theatre. The plans on the bottom right are for the Beacon Theatre. You can automatically, just right off the bat, see a few similarities. The really interesting thing about the Roxy Theatre, from an architectural point of view, is that the lot that it was situated on was irregular. So Walter Allschlager actually rotated the auditorium 45 degrees. So you see this kind of triangular stage here. It wasn't great for theatrical productions, but it really allowed a lot more seating. So this was really a function of the lot that the Roxy sat on. One of the traditions in building theaters, whether it was in the Broadway Theater District or these movie palaces, was to build them either adjacent to or near or in combination with a hotel. The Roxy Theatre was built in conjunction with the Taft Hotel, which would have been over here, and it had an entry into the theater from the hotel. So you can see the foyer and the reception hall. Again, possibly this quite small scale space. From the reception hall, you can either go up the stairs to the mezzanine or the balconies, or you can enter the grand 4 to 5 story foyer. Off of the foyer, you have a small vestibule with elevator lobbies. They had elevators in the Roxy to take you upstairs. Or you could go directly into the auditorium. Now at the Roxy, we have an orchestra pit. I believe the organ consoles would have been near here, adjacent to it, to the orchestra pit, but it's not noted on the plans. This triangular stage, this is a stage lift, and this semicircle in the back is the cyclorama. And then all the back of house spaces, the library, the music room, a small projection room. So then when we start to look at the Beacon, we see a very similar thing. So here at the Beacon, this street would be Broadway. This would be the Beacon Hotel. There was actually an entry from the hotel into the foyer. It's now an ADA accessible bathroom. So this is the entry off of Broadway into a small foyer. Again, pretty low height, darker space. Entry into a really large, multiple story, multiple height foyer. You can have the option to go up the stairs to the loge or the balconies. No elevators in the public spaces of the Beacon. Really. This is a much smaller theater for its time. Just thinking about scale, the Roxy is almost 6,000 seats. The Beacon is almost 3,000. So it's a smaller theater, and the detailing is a little different. But the plan layout's pretty much the same. This is a foyer lobby for the orchestra level. You come into the orchestra. This is the stage area. It's not shown on the plans. This is actually the orchestra pit and the organ pit here, both on lifts, so that they could rise up from below. And the Beacon also had a stage lift, which would have been here, and a cyclorama back here. When we were doing the restoration, we took off the stage floor, which had been inserted, I think, in the 80s, and we actually found this trough in the floor, a semicircle, where the cyclorama lighting would have been. So it was kind of a neat discovery. But so what's so interesting about this is this, to me, is proof that Walter Allschlager basically just took his Roxy Theatre plan and plopped it on a different site, because there's no need to have this kind of diagonal auditorium, because it was really just a square lot. Some of the changes, actually, this is a Rotunda comparison. Roxy Theatre, multi-height space, grand arch, very elaborate detailing, huge marble columns. There's that 58-foot rug a big chandelier, a dome ceiling. And the Beacon Theatre on the right, very similar, smaller scale, simplified detailing. These are the colors that we found when we started the restoration, so don't be alarmed. So some of the changes that, that occurred during that 1-month restoration when Warner Brothers took over the Beacon, I'm going to back up. They actually enclosed the auditorium with this back wall. Before, it was basically just these piers, and then all of this was open. So typically, what would happen in these combination houses is that they would sell out all the seats, and then there was a standing room only at the back, and you could actually see the silent film, hear the orchestra, hear the sound. But because they were converting this to a sound movie theater, they enclosed the auditorium, and it really helped with the acoustics. And as anybody who's ever been in there knows, it's actually got pretty good acoustics. Unlike the Roxy, they put a 2-story projection booth at the rear. And in order to make the projection throw work, they actually cut back the balcony by 2 rows for a better angle for film projection and sight lines. And I'll try to remember to show you this later when I show the photos. So here's my detective work / theory of decorative changes that may have happened in that 1 month. I mean, $2 million, we know that changes for technology cost a lot, but $2 million is a lot of money to spend. So I'm wondering if the decorative scheme actually changed a little bit. I'm just going to go back. So in the Beacon Theatre Rotunda, you actually see a lot of really neoclassical elements. These fluted pilasters, these gold medallions, these swags of fruit and garland. There's a lot of neoclassical detailing in the rotunda, but then as you get into the auditorium, you start to see some more of the exotic decoration. And I'm not sure which came first. I don't know if this was all built during the first round of construction or if it was added later. It works with the story of the theater, which I'll show you in a bit. But one thing that I did pick up when I was doing some research on this is that the Fox Theater in Atlanta actually has a really similar interior decoration scheme. Now, this is a really interesting story. It was a Masonic hall conversion. Fox Theatres, remember the original constructors of the Beacon Theatre, were looking for an auditorium space in Atlanta. And they found one in this Masonic hall. Now, when the Masonic hall and the auditorium were being built, they had an architectural competition in order to award the project to an architect. And the only thing that the architectural competition stated was that they were looking for a building to out-Baghdad Baghdad. So maybe this is where we get a little bit of our Baghdad on Upper Broadway. This was built from 1927 to 1929, same as the Beacon. Started out with the same movie theater company. What you'll see that's really similar is this golden textured plaster and this tent, which is the ceiling of the main auditorium. It's all plaster, but it makes you feel like you're standing under a fabric tent. Just going to quickly run through a little bit of after the golden era of movies before talking about the restoration. So after the crash of 1929, there was a decline in the movie palace. A few other theaters were built, for example, Rothafel's Radio City Music Hall in 1931. However, the public attended cheap, no-frills movie theaters or stayed home to listen to the radio or read. By 1940, the talkies had become spectacles themselves, and the screen, not the surrounding theater, became the focus of attention. The splendor of the films outshone the opulence of the theaters. Movie theaters had a temporary revival during World War II when the public came to see military films, war propaganda, and reviews that inspired patriotism. But by 1948, I think most people were probably trying to save money to buy a TV. The Beacon was acquired by the Brant Theater Circuit in 1944. They ran the theater until 1974. By the 1970s, the Brant's Beacon had become a cut-rate movie house, showing second or third-run movies for $1 as the neighborhood deteriorated around it. I really love this poster. Brant's Beacon Theater. Movies are your best entertainment. Get out and live. Go to a movie. Go to a movie tonight. Yes, the big hits come here first. I mean, it's an awful lot of convincing to get somebody to go to see a movie. Okay. In 1974, Vidicom Systems took over the lease and started a live performance venue, but shut down in 1976 due to financial struggles. The Concert Art Society took a lease on the theater in 1977, intending to run it as a performing arts venue. The Beacon Theater was listed as an interior landmark. These are pretty rare for those of you that know landmarks. There's maybe 120 of them, I think. Listed as an interior landmark in 1979 and placed on the National Register in 1982. In 1986, Babylon Limited signed a lease on the theater and proposed turning the space into an upscale discotheque. The plans entailed removing all of the seats in the orchestra section and turning the area into a dance floor. The new floor would be level with the stage, and the mezzanine would be remodeled to accommodate a 3-tiered restaurant supported by a kitchen in the balcony. So just quickly, these are the original plans of the Beacon, showing the original configuration, the orchestra level, and the mezzanine and the loge. And actually, that white space on the drawing is where you look down into the orchestra level. So this is the proposed discotheque plan, and I'm not sure how well this reads, but basically it's an insertion into the theater. So here is where they would have raised the floor to meet the stage level here. This would have all been dance floor, banquette seating, a bar. On the loge, more banquette seating, a lounge, a bar, this restaurant. I mean, you know, you can kind of imagine sitting in this really funky old theater looking down from the loge on people dancing on the floor below. But I think of this proposal as really of its time. It was 1986. It was like this last gasp effort to use this building that was kind of sitting pretty empty. All sorts of people and organizations had tried to use it for a good purpose, and none of them ever worked. Charles Platt was the architect of this proposal, and he was a former LPC commissioner. And in his descriptions of the work, he really described it as trying to be sensitive to the historic interior surroundings, really trying not to touch any of the interior decoration, and noting that these insertions could be easily removable, and then anything could be repaired or replaced after it was removed. I believe it was preliminarily approved by the LPC, but it actually didn't go over so well with neighborhood advocacy groups. There was a group called Save the Beacon that really fought hard not to have this discotheque inserted into the theater, and they succeeded. Is anybody here from Save the Beacon tonight? No? Okay. I'm always really curious who's in the audience. Because if you are, I want to talk to you. Okay, so that was 1986. The Beacon continued to struggle, and MSG signed a lease in 2006. So I'm just going to extemporaneously speak now. This is what we found when we started the project in 2007. This is the Rotunda Entry. The photo on the bottom right is looking back towards the entry on Broadway. So again, you come from Broadway, you walk into this small, darkly lit foyer, and then you come into this domed space. I find this really fascinating because there's this great portico over the entry with this balustrade and this funny mural over it. And then on the opposite side is this large arch, and you can see the stair to the right of the arch, and that goes up to the loge and the upper balcony. And so similar to the Roxy, you see these windows in the arch, so you actually kind of get views of people walking up the stairs and walking through the lobby spaces, and kind of these glimpses and views of surprises. So you can go straight underneath the arch into the lobby of the orchestra. The Rotunda ceiling and chandelier, you can tell it's a little dirty, it's a little tarnished, but really that was the original ceiling. We kind of got lucky with the ceilings in here because you can you can tell that the maintenance paint, the white and the light blue, that don't really go with the interior decoration, they could only reach so far, so they didn't actually paint the ceilings, which is good news for us. This little photo on the right, yes, that is a gold spray-painted coffee can on the bottom of our chandelier. And we didn't know this until we lowered the chandelier down to the floor, which is actually really cool. There's a catwalk above the dome in the rotunda and a crank, and somebody cranks it down and it comes down on this cable. And that's how they replace all the bulbs. And we replaced a lot of the, just forgetting the word for those, the little glass pieces on the chandelier. But we actually left the coffee can because we thought it was kind of fun. And nobody, I mean, it's one of those treasures, right? It's like you go into Grand Central and you can see the little dirty spot on the ceiling. Next time you go in the Beacon, see if you can see the coffee can. Okay, so I mentioned that this building is an interior landmark, and because of that, we were required to go through a review at LPC, the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So all of the white slides that you'll see are samples of the drawings that we submitted for LPC approval. And we also walked through and showed them the whole process, but then this was actually the book that we submitted for approval. We had this great period of investigation and testing with Evergreen Studios, doing exposure windows to try to find original paint finishes, because we could pretty much guarantee that white and light blue were not original. And then we did mock-ups to try to see what we wanted to do. Now, you can see here on these mock-ups, and I'm going to show you these for pretty much every space. Here's level 1. Level 1 is a replication of the original finish that we saw. So this would include gold leaf, glazing, gilded elements, sponge finishes, animal prints, wild patterns, metallic paints with glazes. And then level 2, which you'll see here, is kind of an interpretation of that, because gold leaf and glaze and gilding are really expensive. And they're not only really expensive, they're labor intensive, which is also really expensive. So level 2 is the interpretive mock-up of the finish. And basically what that is figuring out which elements we really want to highlight with gold leaf and gilding and glazing. If we can't do it all, which ones are the ones that are really going to make these elements pop? Also, with the sponge paint here on the walls, the way that I like to think about this is it's a combination of colors. So if you have multiple colors of sponge painting, if you squint at it, what is the tone that you see? And that's the tone here, one color, that we are proposing as an interpretation of the sponge painting. So the mural in the portico over the door, the 2 color photos are what was there. It's actually wallpaper. We don't think it was original to the Beacon. The little black and white photo is the original mural that was designed for the Beacon by Rambush Studios, and we found this in an advertisement when the Beacon opened. So you can see they're pretty different. These wallpaper murals, I don't quite know what it is. There's water in the background with a ship and some fountains, and I can't make out exactly where it's supposed to be. But the Rambush mural is actually pretty pastoral. Looks maybe like Swiss Alps or the Italian Dolomites or, these Italian evergreens. And then this little Greek temple in the bottom right. But it was black and white in the advertisement, so we really had no idea what the colors were. So we took this to a mural artist, Mason Nye, who has his studios out at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And he proposed a color palette for the mural that would have been appropriate to the time of its design and installation. And he actually painted this huge canvas to fit in the area where the mural might have been. And it was so big that it basically took up all of his studio, and in order for us to stand back and look at it, we had to walk outside of the building and stand out in the alley and peek through the windows to see if we could see it. It was quite a process, and he did an amazing job taking that black and white photo and recreating it in the mural. The beacon originally had a lot of drapery, red velvet, gold tassels, and when we started the project, there was no drapery anywhere. So one part of the finishes package was to reinstall drapery in the rotunda and the auditorium. So this is the rotunda, the before and after. And you can see what a difference, right? I mean, this is kind of a gilded palace. I also want to say that this down here is not marble. It's called scagliola, which is a decorative plaster finish. That was restored by Hales and Howe out of Baltimore. They're plaster conservationists. So because of the scagliola being kind of green and white and kind of cool color, we figured that the drapery should also be green. And that really helped to kind of pick up the green tones in that. But everything else is pretty much gold. There's the mural, which I think really pops, and the color scheme seems really right for the room. So let's think again about our trip from Broadway into the building, and you're in this golden dome, and maybe you're looking out from your balustrade at your house out into this pastoral scene, and there's actually two. There's a little Greek temple, there's a little Greek temple, there's some deer. I mean, it's kind of a neoclassical setting. Keep that in mind. This is the ceiling before and after. Again, it was really just tarnished. It just needed some cleaning and some patching. That was bronze and gold leaf and copper leaf, and it was just a spectacular thing to have this rotunda filled with scaffolding and be up there with the craftsmen who were redoing the ceiling. And then again, as with any architectural project, lighting is so key. So we went through and relamped every fixture in this theater. This is the orchestra level lobby. Now, this didn't have as much overpaint as the rotunda did, but you can see bad blue carpeting. It had creamy walls, but there was really no depth to it. Some kind of weird mural. We're not really sure where that came from or if it was original to the theater. There was still original signage intact, but you can see that the sign inserts were also in really bad shape. They were lit with a bulb from inside, and the bulb had started to burn the plastic. Not a good thing. What I love about this picture, this really shows some of the exposure windows that we did in the lobbies. All the door surrounds were actually painted stencils. They were not architectural, but just beautiful stencils. Unfortunately, we actually decided just to paint over those. They're still under there, so maybe sometime in the future somebody will go back and restore those. So we saw that ugly blue carpet earlier. We found some of these carpet remnants under a little cover at the stage stairs, and comparing that to these patterns that we saw in these historic photos, looked fairly similar. We weren't sure about the color scheme, but we basically decided that red and gold seemed really appropriate. So we took those patterns and we worked with Milliken to design a custom carpet that I think we can call it a pretty close replication of the original. And so on the upper right is a photo sim showing what this orchestra lobby would look like with a new carpet and gold tones on the walls, refurbished lighting fixtures, and signage. This is the after of the signage. We went through and restored all the sign fixtures and then designed new sign text with a really nice font that kind of looks a little bit exotic. So here's our lobby paint sampling and mock-ups. The level 1, the original finish, is on the right. Level 2, the interpretive finish, is on the left. So this low lobby is also a really interesting space. It always reminded me of maybe a really nice cabin in a ship. It had these wood grain beams, which was all decorative paint finish, faux finish, that you can see in here and here. Those are our exposure windows showing the wood graining. All the doors were wood grained, again, a decorative finish. And then it had this rusticated plaster that you'll see here on the walls. Looks like the Fox Theatre. So part of our decision, again, was which elements do we gold leaf, do we gild, which elements do we save some money and maybe it's not so necessary. The plaster walls were a real struggle for us because the original finish was a metallic paint. No, it was a flat paint and a dry brush metallic finish. So it actually starts to pick up some of the depth and it actually glistens. And then you put a glaze over it. And so we did a couple of mock-ups, as you can see here, of replicating in a flat paint, pretty gross and boring, in a flat paint and just a glaze, and a flat paint, and I think we did a dry brush but no glaze over it. So we were trying to come up with kind of a compromise. And, you know, the lobby is a small area. It's not so important comparatively as maybe the Rotunda or the Auditorium. So here I think we actually went with this option, which is a level 2, but it's kind of a level 1.5 almost. Auditorium. Again, you can see all of these walls are that rough plaster, but they'd all been painted cream again. Really bad seats that had been replaced in the 70s or 80s and were in pretty poor condition. Those of you that had been to see shows here, you'll know the floors were really sticky. It had that gritty feeling, right? So it had just been maintained, which is fine for a rock house. This is the auditorium filled with scaffolding, which was it was a pretty cool sight to see. We took all the seats out and put in scaffolding. The floor is raked, which means it's sloped toward the stage, so building scaffolding on a raked floor is a little difficult. This is the paint mock-up of the ceiling underneath the loge. So this area that we're looking at here, right? It would have been under here. Again, level 1 and 2. Originally, lots of stippling, lots of sponge painting. Again, with the wood graining on these beams and gold leaf or gilding. We thought that the underneath ceiling maybe could just go with level 2 because the lighting under there was really dim. And so we didn't really think it was necessary to bring back a lot of the gold leaf there. I do think this is really interesting. These stencils were original, and when they went back and painted in blues and whites, they actually painted white around that stencil. So you can see there, somebody took a lot of care not to paint over the stencil, thank goodness. This is the mock-up for the auditorium walls. We decided that this was really where the plaster needed to have the level 1 finish. You can see in that black and white photo, it's very hard to tell color in black and white photos, but you can see the tone and you can see how all the finishes were very reflective, and we thought that was really important. So we did mock-ups everywhere. We did mock-ups on the balcony fronts, we did mock-ups of the statuary and the arches, we did mock-ups of the plaster walls and ceilings. We did a lot of mock-ups. Again, in the auditorium, drapery was in all the arched openings at all the doorways. When we started, there was no drapery, so we replicated the drapery as best we could with just a plain red velvet and golden tassels and fringe. Seating, you can see on the left the seats that were in there. In the black and white were photos of the original seats. Luckily for us, somebody had kept one of the original end standards. That's this thing. And we were able to take that and have it cast and replicate that for reinstallation. And we did a glazed metallic finish on that as well. The fabric of the seats originally looks pretty light with this dark piping in it, but because the Beacon Theatre is a rockhouse, we knew that there were going to be beer spills and cigarette burns and God knows what else. So we decided we were just going to keep it simple and let's think about maintenance, and we just went back in with a dark red velvet fabric. No piping. This is the proscenium. So again, with the idea of the Beacon Theatre and this big tent, I think this actually looks like a tent, and you can see it's being guarded by these, I don't know, you call them Amazon women, Greek gods, warriors. I'm not quite sure what they are. They've got a spear, and then these are these tent poles that are holding up the proscenium. This is actually where, this is a screen where the organ music would come out, and it had lights behind it. So there was also so much decorative plaster work and statuary. This is a plaster grouping of shields and daggers and spears that was up on the stage, and it was actually really damaged. It had a lot of holes in it. I mean, you can imagine the Rolling Stones playing at the Beacon, and if you've ever seen the concert footage, Keith Richards is smoking a cigarette and playing a guitar, and he just drops his lit cigarette on the stage and stomps it out. And so you can imagine that they were pretty rough with the stage and, you know, taking an amplifier and knocking it into the plaster shields on the edge of the stage. Same with this. The base of this was originally scagliola, covered in black duct tape to protect it. So, you know, there was a lot of protection going on here. This is the auditorium ceiling. Again, similar to the Fox Theatre, I think, plaster tent. And it really looks like fabric. You can kind of see these folds in here. And this great pendant lighting fixture. I don't know if anybody else can read this. Somebody spray painted the letters LSD up there. Rockhouse indeed. This is the ceiling pendant. This is actually a pretty interesting lighting fixture as well, because so there's the catwalk above the auditorium ceiling, and there's a ladder that goes down into the pendant. And each of these has lights in them. And so only the brave house facilities people would climb down that ladder to change the light bulbs. So this is the ceiling restoration. I would say the ceiling was actually not in bad condition. It was really dirty, all the years of cigarette smoke and water damage from roof leaks. It really just needed to be cleaned, maybe patched a little, and then paint touch-ups. So this is called the dance floor, the scaffolding that we used to fill the auditorium, and then the workers, the craftsmen, had their own baker scaffolds to reach the top of the ceiling. Showing some end painting. I think I love this picture. They're hand burnishing the metallic paint and leaf on this, which is just, so I should say that the craftsmen that did this were Creative Finishes, Ernst & Newman, Hales and Hal, who I mentioned earlier. Just an amazing team of really great artists that figured out how to bring back these finishes. This is stenciling. Oh, this is a really good example of stenciling on the upper balcony ceiling where they kind of painted around it. We actually just decided to leave it. You have to kind of choose your battles, I guess. Okay, the ceiling pendant restoration was actually a combination of a lot of different metals. So this was copper leaf and gold leaf and some painted plaster. Oops, wrong way. So this is the before shot. Oh, there's our little cleaning sample, right? Pretty fun. This is the ceiling after. Again, lighting, amazing, but it looks like a tent to me. And especially, I think, these are little bluebirds. So you have your tent with your bluebirds flying around it. Proscenium screen before. I love this sunburst. And then these kind of deco fountains. It reminds me of Siegfried Gideon's book with the fountains. This is the proscenium screen after. The sunburst is gold leaf. The fountains were silver leaf. So you have this great interplay of gold and silver, and then the screen behind it, all decorative plaster, was copper leaf. These are the murals in the auditorium. Oh, here is where they cut out the 2 rows of the balcony for the projection screen, just for your information. You can see this design of the front of the balcony, very different from this design with the panels. Murals. The murals were so dirty, you couldn't even really tell what the content was. This is, on the right, is the cleaning sample. Rustin Levinson Conservators did the mural cleaning and restoration. When we were working on the project, we actually had a piece of a mural fall off because there was a leak in the roof, and it got behind and got through the glue, but we were able to rescue it. So this is the conservator cleaning the mural. This is the after shot, and I love this. It's just so vibrant. It tells such a great story. To me, this is kind of the story of your travel. You started out in the Rotunda, you're looking out at your beautiful pastoral views from your balustrade at your palace somewhere. You get on a boat, you're in that really nice cabin with wood beams, and then you end up getting off this ship and being greeted by all sorts of people bearing fruit, ladies bearing flowers, there's palm trees, there's elephants, there's monkeys, and then you're taken to this big tent where you see a mystical performance. I also really love this because it's so vibrant. It has great depth. This person reminds me of that scene in Indiana Jones where the mural comes to life and the guy steps out of it. So this is the after view of the auditorium and the proscenium. And you can see the new seating, new carpet, new drapery. We restored the scagliola on these bases. This is copper leafing on the columns. We did glazing and gilding on all of the statuary. Great lighting. Okay, so in closing, because I've gone about an hour, I was trying to think of a way to wrap this up, and I think the best way to have a legitimate discussion about this as preservation is thinking of this as a tale of 2 Roxys. So, this on the left is Miss Gloria Swanson, back at the Roxy Theatre for its demolition in 1960. This was a real tragedy, in my opinion, but it was 1960. And the theater was demolished for the construction of a midtown office tower. The demolition of the legendary theater was lamented by theater historian Ben M. Hall, who said that the Roxy vanished in a pile of rubble and dust and some shards of gold-leafed plaster of Paris. Fallow ground where only an office building could grow, marks the realm where romance and adventure flourished, where magic and charm united us all to worship at beauty's throne. I think that these are really interesting comparisons, the original Roxy and the Little Roxy. I think the original Roxy was demolished because of location and timing. Its location in Midtown in 1960 was its downfall, basically. Midtown was developing, the Time and Life building adjacent to Rockefeller Center. They were striving for an office density in Midtown, and then it was adjacent to the Broadway Theater District, which, had so many theaters that were all struggling that some of them were demolished, in the next 10 or 20 years as well. And the timing, it was 1960. We didn't have a landmarks legislation yet. This building was not designated. And there were advocacy groups marching to save this building, but we had no legal protection at the time for that. So down came the big Roxy. The Little Roxy, I think, was saved because of location and timing. Its location on the Upper West Side as this neighborhood theater really kind of made it out of, it was out of the development realm in a way at that time. It was a residential neighborhood, and all of the buildings on Broadway there kind of served the residences. Timing, the Beacon was designated in 1979, and not that it's really been under any threat, but that certainly would help it to remain. And then the advocacy groups like Save the Beacon that kept this discotheque from being inserted into it. So I think they're a really great comparison, and they're family to each other in a way. And with that, I'm going to quit talking and answer any questions. Thank you so much. Oh, great. We're going to give people with questions the microphone.
Thank you. I was wondering about the structural integrity of that giant lamp, the pendant lamp that people were climbing in and around. Yeah. What did you have to do to check that before you got started with the pretty work?
You know what? We had a structural engineer on the job, obviously, Severed Engineering. And the actual iron structure of it, totally fine. And then when you're doing plaster restoration, you sound it to make sure that it's still keyed into the lath or it's, back structure. And so it was actually fine. I mean, the thing that I've found working on historic buildings is that they built them well, and they were craftspeople. And so that was actually okay. Any of the plaster that we had to replace, really, it was mostly because of water damage from the roof leak at the very back of the theater. So we actually had to recreate plaster cornices and decorative elements, in linear footage. But most of the plaster was in really sound condition.
The areas behind the stage, like where the bands would set up and so on, how was that? You didn't show any photos, but how did that change, or did it change?
Yeah. So there was a backstage area. It's basically a tower of dressing rooms. It's got the only elevator in the Beacon, and we did do work for that. And they were pretty ratty as well, I have to say. Dressing rooms, what do you expect? But they all had a tiny little bathroom, and basically the arrangement was like 3 dressing rooms with a little bathroom in between them. And some of the floors were used for offices for the theater management. So we just went in and did new finishes, very plain, nothing too fancy, except for in like a star dressing room or so. And then I'm trying to think, underneath the stage is what's called kind of their green room space, where they would have the stars or the performers hang out before the performance, and after a performance, they would have a little party or a gathering. And again, really just keeping it simple. We had all of the lift structures for the stage lift to contend with down there. Just kind of basic, simplified finishes that we did in those areas. And then bathrooms were in the basement and on the lower balcony level. And again, we just updated those with kind of nice contemporary features. Everything just kind of needed cleaning up in those spaces.
I was wondering if there were any particularly difficult challenges in getting modern theater craft installed into the building. Challenges that extra lighting or information systems, especially reference to the restoration.
Yeah, we worked with some really great theater designers doing the lighting and the acoustics. We actually had to go in and install new speakers and actually, run those and the wiring for that underneath the balconies and such. So they're actually free hanging speakers underneath all of the balconies. And we just decided to let it show. You need to see this technological equipment. There's no sense in painting it gold with glazing. Lighting, I believe, they upgraded it as well, but the rigging for all of that was upgraded, and it's all kind of hidden from the audience. The catwalks in the fly space were structurally upgraded, but that was all kind of really, really technical stuff that I depended on the consultants for because it's not my area of expertise. But they did a great job because they made it pretty easy. All that stuff's kind of hidden anyway.
Is there a way, since it was reconstructed and renovated, to show that it had more attendance or that it was so successful that other people would then be encouraged to restore their own theaters?
I think maybe ticket sales would be the best way to do that, and Madison Square Garden would have that information. I do know that a lot of the shows that I've seen advertised there have been sold out lately, which is great. It's only a 3,000 seat theater, which is not a big auditorium, but for those of us that really like that intimate feel, this has it. I like to think that theater restoration is actually on the upswing, and it's because people like preservation and restoration in general, but then there are also really creative uses these days. I showed the Lowe's Theater, the Flatbush one, which is being renovated, restored by the city EDC right now, and they're going to use that as a performing arts center. But it would be a great project to say, here's proof that this really works as an economic development tool. My sound technician over here, uh-oh.
I'm also your biggest fan now. First, I wanted to thank you very much. Very enjoyable, and I learned a great deal. And I wanted to extrapolate a little bit on my backstory I gave you about Queen's homage to Samuel L. Rothafel. Their song called Spread Your Wings, which is pretty famous, is an homage to him. And also, in chorus with your comment about Keith Richards bashing the building, there's a legendary feud between the Rolling Stones and the band Roxy Music, which is also dedicated to Samuel L. Rothafel. And there's a legendary feud between Brian Ferry, the leader of Roxy Music, and Mick Jagger. Yeah. So all that ties in, and there's a definite parting line aesthetically between those bands, morally, showbiz wise and everything, and I just had to get that in there because you got me so psyched, and I wanted to put it even more in context. And a final comment that Samuel L. Rothafel fought sort of a one-man battle to keep vaudeville alive, and the coming of the movie industry was a personal struggle that he lost eventually, and that's part of that whammy. They got pulled with Fox, pulling the rug and everything. He got caught in that turmoil, and then that was hyper-extended into the music hall, which sort of ended tragically for him because he was finally defeated by movies. And I would add, ultimately, it's kind of maybe not paradoxical that the popular rock culture came back and brought live entertainment back to those very theaters in the long run in a way that trumped the film business and all the synthetic media today, that there's still a ground level need for people to walk in off the street and have some one-to-one human identification with the performer on the stage, and this live experience and the nuance of all that and the immediacy of it and the reality of it is something that is what I live for and why I'm here and why I participate in the General Society. I just had to get that out because you
Agreed.
blew my lid off. Thank you very much.
I think if anybody needs a clue as to Rothafel's influence on the performing venue, just take, for example, that they used to be called the Roxettes, not the Rockettes. And I believe their Christmas Spectacular is still his original choreography. That's right. So, anyway, thank you all.
Cleary, I would like to thank you so much for your fantastic talk. And I love the cinematic touches. And I feel like I do after every landmark lecture that we want to like immediately rush up and see that at close quarters. It really was. We appreciate so much the amount of work and detail you put into your talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Right. We would like to make a presentation to you. This is Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director.
And Cleary, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, thank you for your participation in the General Society Landmark Lectures. We love the lecture. As a native New Yorker and two-time attendee at the Beacon Theatre, both pre and post renovation, I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. Thank you. So that is for you. There you go.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
And this is your new library card because we have to make you a member, of course. So thank you so much.
Right, and this is Meg Stanton, our program assistant, and we want to give Cleary a little souvenir of tonight.
Thank you so much.
So I want to thank you all so much for coming this evening. To remind you, there is now wine and cheese and probably an opportunity to ask Cleary some more questions. And I also want to mention, even though I said the landmark lectures are finished, we are having a lecture on the Schubert theatres, which would be interesting, and I think it's on the 13 Schubert theatres, and particularly on the Belasco Theatre, and this is from the perspective of the facilities manager. So please think about coming back for that, and that's on Tuesday, June the 3rd. Again, thank you so much for coming this evening, and many, many thanks to Cleary.